to the Environment Office weekly webinar number 6. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Karina Serta, the Communications Associate at the Saugeen Ojibway Nation Environment Office. Please send us your topics or questions for future webinars if you have them. Next week, we'll be talking about the proposed TC Energy project near Meaford. We're going through the information booklet that was handed out at the community meetings last weekend. If you want to read more about the project, have a look on our website at saugeenojibwaynation.ca for more information. Tonight I have Ryan Lauzon with me from the Nawash Fisheries Assessment. He's the biologist there, and he'll be joining us in part 2 of our discussion about fish and lake health, with a focus on fish stocking for this discussion. To watch part 1, please visit our YouTube channel by searching Environment Office Saugeen Ojibway Nation on youtube.ca. Thanks very much for joining us, Ryan. Can you tell us a bit more about fish stocking in Lake Huron?
Well, yeah, and first of all, I'd like to say thanks for having me back. I must have done something okay last time. You're willing to have me back. So yeah, it's a bit of a controversial subject in some circles, I understand, which is fish stocking. And certainly the Saugeen Ojibway Nation have a different perspective than some other groups. For example, some of the local sportsman groups and so on that are proponents of fish stocking. I guess the reason I wanted to discuss fish stocking today is because it is an increasingly pressing topic at the Saugeen Ojibway Nation because of what the community sees as the negative effects from fish stocking. And tonight I'd like to talk about 6 main effects that we see from fish stocking. One of those being the ecological effects, one of those being introduction of diseases and parasites from fish stocking, one being predation on native species from those fish being stocked, competition for limiting resources, genetic alteration of native populations, environmental alteration, community alteration. So those are all the ecological effects. And then we get into the economic effects and then the impacts on food security, health, and then the conflict that fish stocking has generated, as well as those impacts on culture and ceremony for the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. All the ecological effects are outlined in the 2001 Crawford monograph, Introductions of Salmonines to the Great Lakes. So maybe I'll start with the ecological effects. So introduction and distribution of diseases and parasites. So when we're bringing in exotic species and putting them into the lake, there's a chance that you will bring along some of the parasites and diseases that are associated with those fish that are either not native to the lake, for example. So fish haven't evolved an appropriate immunity to them. Or sometimes when you have fish stocking and you're raising fish in hatcheries and so on, that large number of fish all in a small area can sometimes generate some diseases and so on. So there are some documentations of diseases and so on that were brought as a result of the fish stocking practices in the Great Lakes. One of the examples is whirling disease. So aside from diseases and parasites, there's also predation. When you're putting an exotic species that's not native to the lake, it has to eat something. And so it's going to be preying on some of the native species that are there. Many of the salmonids, for example, that are being stocked for the sports fishery, they're typically a generalist type of feeder. So they're going to be feeding on just about anything that they can grab a hold of and consume that's a prey for them. Could be fish, could be invertebrates, could be a number of things. And then there's also competition. So when you're introducing a new species into an ecosystem, well, the Great Lakes have evolved, and many of the different niches in the food web are already occupied, which means that there isn't room for another species to be added on top of everything else. So you're going to have competition for the same resources, whether it's food, whether it's spawning habitat. There's all these kind of effects that we probably don't even fully understand, and are of strong concern. And even when talking about back to predation, there is strong concern about the Ministry of Natural Resources Lake Trout Rehabilitation Plan from our fishermen, because they're finding that a lot of these lake trout that are being stocked are showing up with the dominant commercial species, which is whitefish, in their stomachs. And when we're talking about competition, they're finding that a lot of, they're finding lake trout in places they have never seen lake trout before. And a lot of this is these new strains of lake trout that they're bringing in from, for example, a lot of the strains that we see are actually a Lake Seneca strain, which is from upper New York State. So it's not a strain of lake trout that was in the Great Lakes historically. So we don't exactly know what the impacts of these exotic species or exotic strains will be once they enter the lake. We also look at genetic alteration of so the natural species that were there first, and that could happen in a couple ways. One would be direct. So if they were, for example, if they were able to hybridize with something that's already there. And the other one is indirect, where, for example, all these other impacts like competition and so on is reducing the gene pool in the native fish population. So there's less genetic variability, which impacts species' ability to be able to adapt and evolve to changing conditions in the lake, for example. And then there's things like environmental alteration. So fish being stocked or and so on are changing something in the environment. A good example mentioned in the 2001 document is common carp. Everybody's familiar with common carp. They're an Asian species that were not in the Great Lakes originally, and they like to brood around in vegetation in wetlands and so on, and they change the environment through that process. And so that's a good example there. There's also community alteration, which means changing the structure of the fish community. When you add something in that's new, and you keep adding those fish in, you're going to change the structure of the fish communities that live there already, because something has to change to make way for these new fish. So aside from all the ecological stuff, there's also the economical factors. So the economy of the Saugeen Ojibway Nation is quite substantially based upon the commercial fishery, and the introduction of exotic salmonids and new strains of lake trout from elsewhere have an impact on the ability of the fishermen to make a living. So a lot of the fishermen are having greater challenges due to the number of lake trout that are out there. They're not as commercially viable as the lake whitefish that were there before, and they're starting to dominate the fishery. It's becoming more of a lake trout fishery than a lake whitefish fishery, which is causing a lot of financial strain and impacting the ability of the commercial fishermen to make a living, to the point where some of them are actually no longer able to make a living anymore because the whitefish just aren't there. And I'm not saying that stocking is the only reason behind the decline in lake whitefish, but we do strongly believe that it's one of the contributing factors. So in addition to that, we can look at food security. So the Saugeen Ojibway Nation are a fishing community, have been fishing since time immemorial for food, as well as commerce and ceremony. And when you start changing the structure of the fish communities and so on, that changes the ability or impacts the ability of community members to go out and harvest fish as a food source. And that leads into multiple issues because food security is already a strong concern um, in both Saugeen and Nawash. Um, and so anytime that you're impeding people's ability to have that food sovereignty, so to speak, and the ability to go out there and harvest those fish, you're going to have cascading effects, even into things like health. Um, there's many benefits to the Saugeen Ojibway Nation from those fish from a health perspective. And, you know, the Western diet is not necessarily a healthy diet. And if you're basically causing a collapse in the ability of people's ability to go out there and harvest those fish to eat, then you're going to impact those health issues. In addition to health and food security, we also see where stocking is causing conflict between the Saugeen Ojibway Nation and the local groups that are proponents of stocking and the anglers that are upset with the Saugeen Ojibway Nation exercising their right to go out and harvest for commerce, food, and ceremony. So essentially, many of these groups see the Saugeen Ojibway Nation out there harvesting as impacting the fish that they're stocking for recreational fishing. So it has created a lot of conflict in the past and continues to create conflict. If you talk to the fishermen, they'll tell you stories about their net markers getting cut off, um, their nets getting tampered with, for example, slashed open and their gear being stolen, their boats get set adrift. Um, I've seen cases where there was a lot of racist type graffiti and so on put on the boats because people were upset that the fishermen were out there making a living. So it's created a lot of conflict because of this desire to stock fish for the recreational fishery and this idea that those fish are somehow the property of those that are stocking the fish. And it creates this kind of conflict that is very unfortunate. And just to be clear, the Saugeen Ojibway Nation has never expressed any concern with people wanting to go out with an angle or go out and catch a fish and enjoy that. The problem is when you bring in something that's exotic, just because you think it's a little bit more fun to catch than some other type of fish, and then you get into all these issues that I'm talking about here. And then finally, I'd like to mention that fish stocking has an impact from discussions I've had with community members at the Saugeen Ojibway Nation on the cultural and ceremonial aspects in the community. For example, I've been told that whitefish are one of the totems for our clans. They're part of the clan system. So when you stock other species that are not part of that clan system, you're impacting people's relationship with those fish. That's one example. And even fish are very important in any of the feasts and so on that are in the community. If you go to a feast, chances are that fish are going to be one of the primary feast items. So it impacts on that ability and that attachment to those fish as part of the culture of the communities. And that's pretty much, I guess, a very brief outline of fish stocking and the concerns about the impacts that those are having on the Saugeen Ojibway Nation and the impacts to the rights and interests of the Saugeen Ojibway Nation to continue doing the things that they've been doing since time immemorial. Do you have any questions or?
I had at least one that I thought
Okay.
of. One was you talked a lot about the fish stocking itself, but like how long has that been going on for, and kind of like where did that start from, I guess?
Oh, that's a very good question. So there's two types of fish stocking, I would say. There was stocking of exotic salmonids. So for example, rainbow trout, brown trout, and coho, chinook salmon, pink salmon, etc. So originally the salmon were stocked with this idea that by putting in an exotic species that eats a lot of food, you could control another invasive species called the alewife, which at that time the Ministry of Natural Resources was concerned about because there was this big bloom of alewife, which was causing problems for some of the other fish. So there was this idea that if you put in the salmon and so on, that they would eat up all the alewife and then everything would be good again. Well, alewife are largely wiped out from the lakes. So any kind of biological reasoning for that stocking is gone now. So we're left with the other aspect of stocking those species, which was for recreational fishing. And this idea that these fish provide more excitement and so on than some of the native species for angling. So all these exotic salmonids are from the West Coast. They're not, or in the example of brown trout, they're actually from Europe. So they're not native to the lake, and they weren't there originally. Stocking's been going on for many years. I'm gonna say could be as long as 100 years of stocking that's been ongoing, and it continues to this day. So aside from that type of stocking, there's also the lake trout rehabilitation plan. So lake trout are a native species to Lake Huron, and essentially overfishing and sea lamprey are blamed for wiping out the majority of the lake trout out of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. There were two relic populations. For example, there was one over at Perry Sound and one up on the North Shore, I believe. But aside from that, lake trout were gone from the lake, and it was once one of the dominant predator in the lake. So there was an idea from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry that they would like to bring these species back into the lake. The Saugeen Ojibway Nation was never consulted on this idea, and we do have some concerns about that program. One being that instead of using the strains that are native to the lake, there was a little bit of that, but the dominant strain that's being successful is actually, as I mentioned earlier, this Lake Seneca strain that comes from upper New York State. So it's If you talk to community members and they look at one of these lake trout that are in the waters, they say that's not a lake trout. And that's very likely a different species than what they had seen. The oral history and so on would describe from the past when lake trout were actually a native species in this area, and it wasn't these new exotic strains. And I know I've talked to elders that did used to fish those native lake trout, and it was a much different fish from my understanding than the one that's in there now. And we don't fully understand what that strain might do that's different from what the original strain, how it lived in the lake and interacted with lake whitefish, for example, and so on. So there's that concern. And then the other concern is that right now, the lake is under an increasing pressure, and it's largely due to invasive species, in particular the quagga mussel. And the quagga mussel is an introduced mussel that came in from the ballast water of ships, and essentially it has spread throughout Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And the thing about these mussels is they're really good at filtering out food particles out of the lake. They're so good at that that they've actually drastically reduced the ability of the lake to support fish in general. And realizing that there's a decreased ability for the lake to continue to support fish, if we continue to stock large numbers of predatory fish, such as lake trout and salmon, and without thinking about this decreased productivity, we're going to create additional strain upon the fish that are there. These fish have to eat something. There's less prey to go around, but it's problematic in that way.
I guess that kind of leads me to another question in there, but answered a little bit. When you talk about fish stocking in particular, is there any fish stocking that happens of native species, or is it all predominantly invasive species? And then the second part of that question, I guess, would be, like, do you foresee a way that we could shift over to doing fish stocking in the Great Lakes of more native species as opposed to those predatory species that are causing those issues?
That's a very good question. So I'll break that question down, I guess. So your first question was, remind me.
More around, like, is there fish stocking happening right now that's of more native species like
Right.
whitefish or other important culturally and ecologically significant species?
There are some programs out there doing that. In fact, I was fortunate enough to be invited to Shawnigan First Nation last year, and we were able to witness some of the work they're doing with their walleye or pickerel, as we call it. And it is essentially a spear fishery where the walleye come into the river to spawn, and the traditional practice there is to spear those fish for food. And when they do so, they take the eggs and they take the milk from the male fish, and they fertilize those eggs, and they bring them back and they hatch them out. And all the while they use the same water from the area in their hatchery, and essentially they just let those eggs develop, and then they just let them wash back out into the river so that the next generation of fish can develop. And they have been extremely successful with that model. Their pickerel or walleye fishery is going extremely strong, and I certainly witnessed the strength of that particular approach. And actually, even at Saugeen and Nawash, it was traditional to take the eggs and the milk from whitefish when they were harvested and to mix them together with a feather and actually put them back onto the shoals so that they would have a chance to produce the next generation. And although that's not done as much anymore, it is still practiced to some degree. Now, did that answer your question?
It did, yeah. And the other half of it was more about like moving forward to do with that. It's kind of a complicated question, I guess, that there's not really necessarily a good answer for, but like, do you foresee a way that like we in the region in general can shift over more towards stocking native fish species that aren't as predatory?
Yeah, that's something that we're considering is whether or not we should be participating in stocking of native species that are in decline. For example, lake whitefish. Stocking isn't always the answer. And so it's certainly a tough decision, and it will be one that the communities have to really mull over and make a decision on because fish stocking, as we already discussed, doesn't always have those kind of positive effects that you might want. For example, with lake whitefish, for example, if we were to go and do a stocking program with these fish, we'll have to consider things like, will we be doing more harm to the whitefish that are already out there than good? Because of the possibility of introducing disease out into the wild, or the possibility that you're going to influence the genetics of the wild population in some way that's negative. So we'll have to carefully weigh all these considerations to determine whether or not that's something that we would be considering doing. And in an ideal scenario, you don't stock fish. Stocking fish is a signal that there's something wrong because the wild fish are not able to sustain themselves. And that's a concern, that's an issue. So then you have to figure out, okay, stockings are, maybe a technique to use in some cases, but you're not addressing the underlying concern. Why do you have to stock those fish? And I think that that's the real primary issue that needs to be addressed. Why do you continue to stock these fish? What is the reason behind that? It's very complex as to what those reasons might be. For lake whitefish, for example, we know that there's declining productivity, and there's also a belief that in the lake, there's also a belief that those young whitefish don't have anything to feed on when they hatch because those mussels are taking all the food out. So those plankton that would have been there might not be available for those young fish to feed on. How do we address mussels? That's not an easy solution. Nobody's figured out exactly how we're going to address that. Eventually, I believe that nature always finds a way, but it's going to take time. For example, gobies were a huge issue. A lot of fish, it's another invasive fish species, and it predates on fish eggs, so that was a concern. A lot of fish are now figuring out that gobies are great to eat, and they're consuming those. Even with quagga mussels, lake whitefish are feeding on those mussels, but they just don't have the same energy density and so on that the prey that they used to feed on, primarily for example, the diaperia had. So it's very complex, and it's certainly stocking, I think, is a last resort. It's certainly not an ideal situation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ryan. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge. So that was it for my questions. And
okay, well, thanks very much, Karina, and thanks to anybody who might be watching.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you guys for tuning in, and check back next week for our one on the TC Energy project.